With the release of the new Sigma 35mm f2 DG DN lens on the 1st of January 2021, Sigma now have a total of 3 35mm options for full-frame Sony mirrorless cameras. In that lineup there is of course the Sigma 35mm f1.2 DG DN Art, the Sigma 35mm f1.4 DG HSM Art, and as we've already mentioned, there's the new Sigma 35mm f2 DG DN Contemporary lens. Now despite all three of these lenses sharing the same focal length, they are 3 totally different animals with their own sets of pros and cons. So today I thought it would be interesting to pitch all of these options against one another to find out which one I think is the best Sigma 35mm option currently available. Just like any of the lens group tests that I do here on the channel, there is a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm just going to do us all a favor and cut the crap so that we can get stuck straight into the specifics of each of these lenses. So let's start out by taking a look at the cheapest option in today's lineup, which is the brand new 35mm f2 version. In terms of price, this 35mm f2 can be purchased for around £549 or $639, and it's also the smallest and lightest lens in our test, weighing in at just 325 grams or 11.46 ounces. It's actually that lightweight that when it's mounted to my Sony a7 Mark III, this lens makes my camera feel slightly back heavy, which is certainly something I cannot say about the other 2 lenses in our test. Another thing that separates this lens from its siblings is the fact that it's made almost entirely from metal. Even the focus ring and lens hood are made from a textured metal. So needless to say that this thing feels super high quality and solid in the hand. It also comes with a pretty fancy magnetic lens cap, which I actually found really nice to use. However, if this type of thing doesn't float your boat, then Sigma do also include a regular plastic cap in the box too. On the lens body itself, there is a manual aperture dial which clicks nicely at each third of a stop. However, unlike the 35mm f2, this lens doesn't have a D-click switch to allow you to rack through the aperture range in one smooth motion. Now this might be some bad news for videographers who like this feature to adjust the exposure on the fly without having to awkwardly click through each of the stops on this ring. The manual aperture dial can also be switched to automatic mode, noted with an A, which also allows the lens to function more like a standard lens where you can adjust the aperture value using the back of your camera instead. However, it should also be noted that there is no lock switch on this lens, so you can't keep this lens fixed into auto mode, and the downside of not having a lock switch means that this dial can accidentally get knocked from auto mode to some random aperture value in your bag or whilst you're carrying it on a camera strap, so it's just something to bear in mind. Also on the side of the lens barrel there's an MF to AF switch which has a slightly new design compared to the other 2 and operates with a very satisfying click. Finally, on the lens mount there's a small rubber O-ring that provides weather sealing to prevent dust and moisture getting inside your camera. The Sigma 35mm f1.4 DG HSM Art lens is the oldest of the 35mm in our group test and was originally designed for DSLRs and later retrofitted with a small bit on the bottom so that it can fit onto mirrorless cameras without the need of a lens converter. These days on Amazon you can pick up a Sony E-mount copy of this lens for around £649 or $695, making it about £100 more expensive than the newer f2 variant. Unsurprisingly, this f1.4 version is notably heavier than the f2 version, weighing in at 755 grams or 26.6 ounces. But despite this added weight, when mounted to my Sony a7 Mark III, it still feels very nicely balanced in the hand. The lens itself is mainly made from metal, hard plastics and a rubberized material that adds grip to the focus ring. On the side of the lens barrel there's a focus distance window as well as an MF to AF switch, but that's about it in terms of features. Finally, on the lens mount there's also some weather sealing to prevent dust and moisture entering the camera body with this lens attached. The Sigma 35mm f1.2 DG DN Art lens is by far the most expensive lens in our test. On Amazon you can pick this lens up for around £1,350 or $1,450, meaning that it costs more than the f2 and the f1.4 versions combined. Because of its wider maximum aperture value of f1.2, this lens is much larger and heavier than the other choices, weighing in at 1,080 grams or 38.1 ounces, and it's predominantly made from the same metal, hard plastic and rubber as the f1.4 version. When mounted onto my a7 Mark III, there's no escaping the fact that this is a beefy lens, and it does make the camera feel slightly front heavy, but it's really not enough to be a huge problem in all fairness. Just like the smaller f2 lens, this f1.2 version features a manual aperture dial which rotates with a satisfying click at every third of a stop. Just like the f2, it's also missing a lock switch for this dial, which I feel is somewhat of a missed opportunity given the larger size of this lens. On the plus side though, this lens does have a D-click switch on the side, which may score some brownie points with videographers. Just like the 35mm f2's manual aperture dial, this one can also be switched to automatic mode to function more like a standard lens. On the side of the barrel, there's an MF to AF switch, as well as an AF lock button, which can be customized to function as a shortcut to a host of camera settings. Like all of the other 35s in our test, this lens has a metal lens mount and weather sealing. So now we know what the lenses are made of, let's head over to the lens chart to see which one of them is the best in terms of image quality, starting with the 35mm f2. When shooting wide open at f2, we can see that at the edges of the frame there is a small amount of barrel distortion as well as some vignetting, but nothing really dramatic. Zooming into the center and we can see that this lens is fairly sharp. It's not the sharpest lens in the world, but it's really not bad. The good news though is that there are no signs of fringing at all at the center. Moving over to the corners and things start to get a little bit soft and smudgy, and there is also a touch of purple and green fringing starting to appear, but overall a pretty good performance from this lens. Next up is the f1.4, and we can see that when shooting wide open, the edges of the frame are noticeably darker than the center due to vignetting. And also there is some barrel distortion going on as well, just like the f2 lens. Zooming into the middle of the frame, and the sharpness is pretty much on par with the f2 lens, but there does seem to be a touch more contrast within the image. There's also some purple fringing going on too, which isn't perfect. At the edges, the sharpness drops off a bit, but it's certainly sharper than the f2 lens. The purple fringing issue is still present here, but it's by no means out of control. Overall, the f1.4 lens is let down by a touch of fringing at the center, but offers a much better result at the edges when compared to the f2 version. Last on the list is the f1.2 lens, and we can see immediately that there are some lens distortion and vignetting issues going on at the edges, which appear slightly worse than the other two lenses that we've tested so far. At the center, this lens is the sharpest of the group, and there is no signs of fringing at all. At the corners, things are slightly softer, but it's still the sharpest result so far. There is a touch of chromatic aberration starting to peek through, but that's really all there is to complain about here, so a very good performance from this lens. So far, the f1.2 lens is proving to be the sharpest in the group, so let's now take a look at some portraits that I took of my friend Hannah to see how these lenses perform when in real life situations. All three lenses produced lovely looking images, though somewhat unsurprisingly the f2 doesn't offer quite as thick of a blur in the background as the f1.4 and the f1.2 when shooting wide open. So if you're looking for a lens that can create plenty of subject separation and lovely smooth bokeh, then this one might not be your first choice. The f1.2 and the f1.4 on the other hand provide much nicer bokeh in comparison. In terms of sharpness, all three lenses are very close to be fair, though if you pixel peep you could make an argument that the f1.2 is the sharpest of the three. If you ask me personally, I'm still not convinced it's £1,350 worth of sharpness, but technically it is the sharpest option of the three lenses. In our bokeh balls test, the f2 lens provides round orbs in the middle which start to turn more elliptical as they near the edges of the frame. The 35mm f1.4 lens creates more elliptical orbs at the center of the frame, and these progress into more prominent cat's eye shapes as they get closer to the edge of the frame. And finally, the f1.2 offers a similar result to the f2 lens with nice round orbs in the middle which quickly turn into that cat's eye shape as they get to the edge of the frame. So enough with image quality, let's turn our attention to AF performance now. And all three lenses worked really well with both face detection and IAF on my A7 Mark III when focusing at a medium distance. In a previous test with the 35mm f1.2, I did have some issues with the AF when focusing close up using face detect and IAF, and the reticle would kind of just start freaking out a little bit, and it was as if it was struggling to lock onto focus for some reason. However, this time around when I tested it, it didn't give me any issues at all, which is really very strange. The only thing I can think of to explain this behavior is that last time Hannah's hair was throwing off the AF for some reason, but even if that was the case, the f1.4 seemed to work fine, so who knows? I guess the important thing to take away here is that it worked with no issues this time around, so that's what we've got to take into consideration when coming up with our verdict. When it comes to AF speed, all three lenses were quick and accurate in good lighting conditions when focusing between near and far subjects. In low light, the good performance continued. All three lenses were quick and didn't show any signs of hunting. If I had to be picky and choose a winner, I would say that the f1.2 was the quickest to focus, followed closely by the f2, and then the f1.4 was the slowest. But just to be clear, we are talking about fractions of a second here, and none of these lenses are by any means slow to focus. When shooting in video mode, all three lenses were fine when the subject was further away. However, as the subject nears the frame, the f1.4 and the f1.2 kind of lose track a bit and then jump into focus at the last minute, whereas the f2 lens is able to keep focus throughout the walk. This was the same result when walking towards the camera at a faster pace too. However, I must say that to be fair, the f2 does have the slight advantage in this test, as its maximum aperture has a much deeper depth of field than its siblings, meaning that keeping sharp focus is obviously much easier than with the f1.2. And as you can see here, when stopping down the f1.2 lens to f2 to match the f2 lens, you can see that it no longer has such a hard time keeping track when the subject gets closer to the camera. As for AF noise, the f2 is definitely the quietest. Though that's not to say that the other two are loud by any means, they are both pretty quiet too. It's only when really listening to these lenses side by side that you can tell that the f2 is just so quiet it doesn't make a peep, whereas the other two make a bit of a grinding sound, but nothing that you would notice in real life situations. Okay, so tests are done. It's now time for the final scoring. So in this section, we're going to run through each of the tests and award a point to the best performer in each of those categories. And that way, hopefully, we should find at the end, we have a clear indication as to which of these lenses is the best within the group. Now, starting with price, this is slightly tricky as technically the f2 lens is the cheapest of the three options, but the f1.4 lens is only marginally more expensive, and it does offer a much wider maximum aperture, which is probably more useful and something you tend to pay more for. So I guess the sensible thing to do here would be to offer both lenses a point in this round. As for build quality, the f2 is by far the nicest built of the bunch, but that's not to say that the others are badly built in any way. It's just that the f2 kind of takes things to a next level with its all metal construction, so it rightfully deserves the point in this round. In terms of handling, I think the f2 also picks up another point here. The size and weight of this lens just makes it an absolute joy to use. You kind of forget that it's mounted to your camera most of the time. The switches and the dials all operate so nicely. The f1.2 is just unfortunately just too heavy to win this round, and the f1.4 just isn't a bad lens to use, but it clearly isn't as nice as the f2. So it just can't win this round, so a point goes to the f2 lens. Now, when it comes to image quality, there is no doubt in my mind that the f1.2 is the better option. It's the sharpest lens in the center and at the corners, plus it doesn't have any chromatic aberration issues like the f1.4 did. Now, we should mention it does suffer from some fairly significant barrel distortion issues, but once you import your raw files into Lightroom or Photoshop, this thing is kind of corrected automatically with a click of a button and becomes a real non-issue. So I think a well-earned point goes to the f1.2 in this round. In terms of bokeh, the f1.2 just has to take the point for obvious reasons. Now, although the f2 offers a similar performance when it comes to bokeh ball shape, the ability to shoot at f1.2 is just going to give you much smoother bokeh in comparison. The f1.4 is a close second place, but ultimately the f1.2 has to get the point here. Now, AF performance is a very close call. There's not a lot to separate these lenses. All three lenses work really well. However, the f1.2 is marginally faster when it comes to taking photos. In video mode, things get a little bit muddy because technically the f2 was the better lens to use when shooting wide open, but as we've discussed, when you stop the f1.2 down to f2, the performance is almost identical. I think ultimately, although it's a very close call, the f1.2 is the marginally better choice and it gets the point in this round. Well, butter my arse and call me a biscuit. It appears that we have a tie between the f2 and the f1.2, which honestly isn't something I was expecting. So what does this mean for our test? Well, after sitting here for a little while and thinking about it, I think to gain some perspective on this situation, I think we need to take a look at which rounds each lens has won a point in. Essentially, once you boil it all down, the f1.2 is the better choice if you want the best image quality and AF performance, and also if you have a bigger budget and you're not afraid to spend more money on your lenses. However, if handling and a low price point is your priority, then the f2 is definitely the best option. It's immaculately built and much more affordable than the f1.2. And ultimately, if you want a lens that offers a decent blend of affordability, performance, image quality, then there's always the f1.4 to consider. It's getting a little bit long in the tooth now, it's quite an old lens, but it does okay in all areas of testing. I mean, it's not outstanding, definitely not enough to win this test, but it's an okay lens and still a very affordable price. Now, I know that's probably not the decisive conclusion you're all hoping for, but I guess that's what you get when you test three lenses that, despite sharing the same focal length, all sit on opposite ends of the scale. I mean, quite literally when it comes to weight. But anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel. We release videos just like this every single Friday, and as always, guys, I look forward to seeing your beautiful little faces in the next one.